Welcome, my friend, to the warmth of Baker Street Ember. Settle in by the fire.
As we prepare for tonight's tale, I must ask, from which shadowy corner of the world are you listening? If you find comfort here, please subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Now,
London fog lay thick upon the city that autumn evening. At 221B Baker Street, Holmes sat idle, craving challenge. Then came the knock. A wealthy tobacco merchant found dead at his Kensington mansion, poisoned by his own cigar, it seemed. Scotland Yard saw suicide amid financial ruin. But Holmes saw a link, the ash from the cigar, gray and flaky in a way no common tobacco burnt. One link in a chain that would bind a killer. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The first link. I set down these events as they occurred in the autumn of 1892, when the chill of the season seemed to seep into the very bones of London. The fog that evening lay thick upon the city, a damp gray veil that muffled the clatter of hansom wheels on the wet cobblestones and carried the sharp, acrid smell of coal smoke rising from countless chimneys. At 221B Baker Street, Holmes and I had returned after a long, fruitless day. The rooms were warm from the coal fire crackling in the grate, but heavy with a rich, earthy aroma of his strong tobacco. Holmes lounged in his armchair, his long fingers steepled under his chin, the Stradivarius violin resting neglected on the table amid scattered chemical apparatus and test tubes. A sharp rap echoed up the 17 steps, cutting through the quiet like a sudden pistol shot. Mrs. Hudson's light footsteps followed, the wooden treads creaking softly, and she opened the door to announce Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. He entered quickly, his rough tweed coat still glistening with fog-damp moisture, his face flushed from the bitter cold outside. "Evening, gentlemen," Lestrade said, shaking his hat and sending droplets scattering across the worn carpet. "A nasty business in Kensington. Sir Reginald Hargrove found dead in his study. Poison, we believe, though it appears to be suicide. The Yard is puzzled, and I thought of you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes' eyes gleamed with that peculiar light of interest. "Sit, Lestrade, and tell us everything." Data. I cannot make bricks without clay." The fire popped and hissed, throwing warm light across the room, while I poured the inspector a measure of brandy from the tantalus. Its sweet, burning aroma mingled with the lingering tobacco smoke and the faint damp chill that clung to Lestrade's clothes. Lestrade settled into the leather chair, which creaked under his weight. Hargrove was a wealthy tobacco importer, but lately in financial difficulty. This morning his butler found him slumped at his desk, a half-smoked cigar in the ashtray beside him. The doctor says cyanide, likely introduced into the cigar itself. No suicide note, but his business affairs were in ruin, so suicide seems the obvious explanation. I leaned forward, cupping my hands around the hot cup of tea to ward off the cold draft slipping under the door. "Yet you doubt it?" The distant toll of Big Ben came through the fog, slow and mournful, adding gravity to the moment. "Indeed, Dr. Watson," Lestrade replied, grimacing at the brandy's bite. The study door was locked from the inside, the window barred. No sign of forced entry or struggle. But the safe stood open, papers disturbed though apparently nothing taken. And Lady Hargrove insists her husband was not despondent. They had entertained guests at dinner only the previous evening, people who all smoke in one form or another. Holmes drew thoughtfully on his pipe, sending fresh curls of strong shag into the air. "Intriguing. We must see the scene without delay." He rose in one fluid motion, his dressing gown swirling, and we quickly donned our overcoats, the rough wool scratching against my skin, and descended the stairs into the foggy night. Our hansom cab rattled through the streets, wheels clattering over slick cobblestones, the horses' hooves ringing sharply. Fog horns moaned low from the direction of the Thames, their sound carrying eerily on the damp air. We reached the Hargrove mansion in Kensington, a tall, imposing house looming through the mist, its gas lamps flickering weakly like dying stars. The butler, Jenkins, a stooped, elderly man, admitted us. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble hall floor as he led us forward, the air thick with the stale perfume of old cigars and beeswax polish. The study door opened to release a heavy wave of bitter tobacco residue mixed with a sharp, medicinal tang of carbolic soap used by the police. The body had been removed, but the desk still bore the marks of death. An overturned inkwell, scattered papers on the smooth mahogany, and the ashtray holding a mound of gray ash beside a partially consumed cigar. Holmes knelt at once, lens in hand, while I felt the cold of the floorboards through the knees of my trousers. "Observe closely, Watson," Holmes said quietly, the dying fire in the hearth crackling behind him. "This ash is unusual flaky, with a distinct silvery sheen. It is not the coarse gray of ordinary Virginia leaf, nor the fine white powder of Turkish blend." He carefully scraped a portion into a small glass vial, the cool surface glinting in the gaslight. I bent nearer and inhaled. The scent of the ash blended with a faint whiff of Thames mud drifting in from a slightly open window, damp, earthy, and river sour. What does it tell us? The rain had begun again, tapping steadily against the window panes like impatient fingers. "A first link, Watson," Holmes murmured, his gaze sweeping the room. The worn threads of the carpet near the door, the smoother pile closer to the desk. "This is the ash of a rare Havana cigar blended with a touch of Peruvian herb. It burns slowly and leaves this characteristic flake. Very few in London indulge in it. Hargrove himself favored milder tobaccos." We continued our examination as footsteps sounded in the hall. Lady Hargrove entered, her silk gown rustling softly, her face pale and drawn beneath the flickering gaslight. "Gentlemen, I beg you to discover the truth," she said, her voice trembling like the low moan of the fog horns outside. Holmes questioned her with gentle precision. "Who dined here last night, and who remained to smoke afterward?" We sat in the leather chairs, which creaked as we settled. Jenkins brought bitter coffee on a tray. Its sharp taste lingered on my tongue. "5 guests," she answered. "My brother Edmund Vale, a rival in the trade. Mr. Silas Thorne, my husband's business partner. Miss Eliza Fenton, a dear friend of the family. Dr. Harlan Croft, our physician, and Captain Roderick Blaine, an old comrade from the army." They all partook of cigars or pipes after dinner. Holmes listened intently. Then later, back in our Baker Street rooms, he plucked absently at the violin strings, their soft twang cutting across the crackle of the fire. "The ash is our first true link. Did you forge its meaning before I did, dear listener?" He paced before the hearth, the warmth battling the cold that still clung to our coats. The faint mud traces on the rug, urban grit mingled with reddish dockside clay. The link. Such soil adheres only near the East End wharves where tobacco ships discharge their cargoes. The forge. I recall a parallel in the naval treaty affair, where a single boot print of similar clay betrayed a diplomat's clandestine meeting by the river. The man had forgotten that the ground itself remembers every step taken in deception, recording movements more faithfully than any witness. Here, too, the earth has spoken. The chain. Therefore, someone entered the study, not merely from the corridor, but perhaps by a garden path near the river access. The link forges strong, Watson. What chain would you build from this single observation? The bind. Night deepened. The gasogene fizzed as I mixed sodas, the sweet brandy warming my throat. Holmes stood by the window, watching the fog press against the glass like a living thing. Another small link. The safe dial shows unusual, where on certain numbers, frequent use, yet the papers seem undisturbed except for one missing ledger page. I shook my head in quiet admiration. "How do you notice such details?" The smooth leather of the Persian slipper felt cool as Holmes reached for more tobacco. "You know my methods, Watson." His faint smile was visible in the firelight. Looking back, I should have seen the connections myself. The chain had begun with that peculiar ash, tying together hidden motives amid luxury, smoke, and deceit. Holmes' mind never rested. You, dear reader, may already have glimpsed the next link forming. We retired at last, the fire dying to embers, the night's bitter chill creeping in as Big Ben tolled 12 through the muffling fog. The first link forged. The chain begins. Chapter 2. Forging Connections. The morning after our first visit to the Hargrove mansion dawned gray and damp, the persistent fog of London still clinging to the rooftops and muffling every sound. I record these details from my journal as they unfolded, for the chain of deduction was already beginning to take form in Holmes' mind, even if it remained invisible to me. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned steadily, throwing a warm glow across the room and driving back the chill that seeped through the window frames. The air carried the familiar mixture of Holmes' strong shag tobacco, the faint bitterness of yesterday's coffee grounds, and the damp, earthy scent of fog-soaked wool from our overcoats hung near the door. Mrs. Hudson brought up breakfast, hot tea steaming in the pot, toast crisp at the edges, and a small dish of marmalade whose sharp citrus cut through the heavier smells. Holmes ate little, pacing before the fire with long, rapid strides, his dressing gown swirling. "Today we forge connections, Watson," he said, pausing to draw thoughtfully on his pipe. "We visit the 5 guests. Their words, their habits, their very ashtrays will supply the next links." We set out in a hansom cab, the wheels rattling over wet cobblestones, the horses' hooves clipping steadily through the mist. Our first call was Edmund Vale's townhouse in Mayfair. The hallway smelled richly of stored cigars, dark, spicy, expensive, and the butler led us into a study lined with humidors and leather-bound ledgers. Vale received us standing beside a blazing hearth, a freshly lit Havana already between his fingers. The smoke curled upward in slow blue spirals, carrying that distinctive Peruvian undertone Holmes had noted the night before. "Terrible thing about Reginald," Vale said, his voice deep and slightly hoarse from years of tobacco. "We were rivals, yes, but never enemies." He gestured to the ashtray on his desk. A small pile of silvery flaky ash lay there, identical in texture and sheen to the sample Holmes had taken from the crime scene. Holmes bent over it without asking permission, examining it through his lens. "Your blend, Mr. Vale?" he inquired mildly. "Special order from Havana, small addition of Peruvian leaf for smoothness and burn," Vale replied, tapping ash into the tray. "Why do you ask?" "Because the same ash was found beside your brother-in-law's body," Holmes said simply. Vale's expression hardened, but he answered steadily. "I was in his study after dinner. Yes, discussing an overdue account. I left him alive and smoking his own milder cigar. I returned here by 11. We departed, the hansom carrying us next through the bustling city to Silas Thorne's office near the Royal Exchange. The streets rang with the clatter of carts and the shouts of newsboys. Big Ben told the hour, deep and resonant through the fog. Thorne's premises smelled of ink, sealing wax, and the milder, earthier smoke of Latakia pipe tobacco. He greeted us behind a broad desk piled with ledgers, his pipe already alight. "Reginald and I were partners 15 years, Thorne said, exhaling a cloud that hung heavy in the air. "Lately he borrowed heavily, speculation in colonial shipments." I urged caution. He wouldn't listen. Holmes studied the pipe bowl. "Your tobacco is different strong, but no Peruvian admixture." "Correct." "I prefer consistency." Thorne's alibi was simple. He had left the dinner early, pleading a headache, and spent the evening at his club. Yet his fingers drummed nervously on the desk, and I noticed a faint tremor. The link was forming: access, opportunity, and perhaps motive in those strained finances. Did you spot it before, Holmes, dear reader? We pressed on to Miss Eliza Fenton's modest flat in Bloomsbury. The stairs creaked under our boots. The landing carried the faint smell of damp plaster and coal smoke from the small fire in her sitting room. She received us with red-rimmed eyes, offering weak tea whose bitterness matched the mood. Her hands trembled as she poured. "I was very fond of Sir Reginald," she whispered. "He was kind to me when my father died. I stayed late after dinner talking, nothing more." "Did you smoke?" Holmes asked gently. "No, but I watched the gentlemen light their cigars." Edmund offered one to Reginald, very insistent, I thought. Her silk shawl slipped from her shoulder, smooth against the rough wool of the chair. The rain tapped insistently at the window. Holmes noted her distress, but pressed no further. A possible threat of affection or jealousy seemed to dangle here. Our fourth visit took us to Dr. Harlan Croft's surgery in Harley Street. The sharp, clean smell of carbolic soap greeted us at the door, overpowering the faint coal smoke drifting in from outside. Polished instruments lay cold on a tray. The waiting room fire crackled softly. Croft, tall and precise, met us in his consulting room. I examined Sir Reginald after dinner, he said. He complained of slight indigestion, nothing serious. I prescribed nothing. I left by 10:30. You handle poisons in your practice? Holmes asked. Medicinal doses only, morphia, atropine, cyanide for certain preparations. All locked away. His cigarette ash was fine and white, quite unlike the specimen we sought. Yet his calm seemed too perfect, rehearsed. Finally, we reached Captain Roderick Blaine's club in Pall Mall. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of old leather armchairs. Billiard balls clicked in the distance. A fire roared in the grate. Blaine, broad-shouldered and loud-voiced, welcomed us with a booming laugh that did not reach his eyes. Old comrade Hargrove served together in India, he said, lighting a fresh Havana. The ash fell in the same distinctive flaky pattern. We argued that night over money he owed me from a joint venture years ago. I left angry, but alive he was when I departed. Holmes examined the ashtray. You share Vale's taste in cigars. A small luxury, Blaine replied. But I returned to my rooms alone. Ask the night porter. Back at Baker Street as evening fell, the fog had thickened again, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The gasogene fizzed as I prepared brandy and soda. The sweet liquor warmed my throat against the chill. Holmes stood before the fire, violin in hand, plucking a few idle notes that cut across the crackle of burning coal. Links are multiplying, Watson, he said. Bill and Blaine share the rare blend. Thorne has financial motive and access to the safe. Fenton carries some secret emotion. Croft has knowledge of poisons. Yet the ash points most directly to the smoker of that Peruvian Havana. I sipped my drink, feeling the smooth glass cool against my palm. And the mud on the rug? Still unexplained, dockside clay does not lie. Someone came from the riverside. He smiled faintly. The chain is taking shape. One more day, perhaps, and we shall see its full outline. The fire popped. The fog horns moaned distantly from the Thames. I marveled, as always, at how Holmes wove these scattered observations into something solid and unyielding. You, dear reader, may already be forging the next connection in your own mind. Links forging. The chain takes shape. Chapter 3. The chain grows. Looking back upon the third day of our investigation, I find the events etched with particular clarity in my memory, for it was then that the scattered observations began to interlock with something approaching inevitability. The fog had lifted only slightly by morning, leaving a raw, damp chill that penetrated even the thick walls of 221B Baker Street. The coal fire roared in the grate, its crackle a steady counterpoint to the patter of rain against the window panes, while the air carried the mingled scents of Holmes' pipe tobacco, strong and earthy, and the faint, bitter residue of last night's coffee. Mrs. Hudson had just cleared breakfast. The hot tea had warmed my hands, though its taste still lingered sharply on my tongue. Holmes stood before the mantel, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on the small vial of ash he had collected from the Hargrove study. We return to the scene, Watson, he said abruptly. Daylight will reveal what shadow concealed. The chain grows, but only if we seek the next link where it lies hidden. We descended the 17 steps, donned our overcoats, the rough tweed still carrying the damp of yesterday, and hailed a hansom. The cab rattled through Kensington's quieter streets, wheels hissing on wet cobblestones, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Foghorns moaned distantly from the Thames, low and mournful, as though the river itself mourned Sir Reginald. Jenkins admitted us to the mansion with his usual quiet deference. The hallway smelled of beeswax polish and stale cigar smoke. Our footsteps echoed on the marble. When the study door opened, the familiar wave of bitter tobacco, ash, and carbolic soap rolled out to meet us. The room felt colder than before, the fire unlit, the gas lamps turned low. Holmes moved at once to the desk, lens in hand, while I felt the chill of the floorboards through my boots. Observe the ashtray again, he murmured. It has been moved, only a few inches, but deliberately. See the faint circular mark where it stood originally. He traced the polished mahogany with a fingertip. The wood felt smooth and cool. Someone returned after the police left. I bent closer. The mound of ash remained, silvery and flaky, but now I noticed a single dark fleck embedded in it, almost invisible unless the light struck at the right angle. "What is that?" I asked. "A fragment of cigar wrapper, perhaps, or something more." Holmes scraped it carefully into an envelope. The rain drummed harder outside, a steady rhythm like distant footsteps. We turned our attention to the window. The bars were solid iron, cold to the touch, but Holmes knelt and examined the sill. Here, traces of the same dockside clay we found on the rug. Someone opened this window from outside, stood upon the sill, and reached in. He straightened. The garden path leads directly to the river landing. The mud remembers. Watson. Lady Hargrove appeared at the doorway, her silk gown rustling faintly, her face pale in the dim light. "Have you discovered anything new, Mr. Holmes?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Several things, madam," Holmes replied. "May we speak privately?" We moved to the leather armchairs near the hearth. Jenkins relit the fire, and soon warmth began to spread, though the chill still clung to the corners of the room. He brought a tray of bitter coffee. Its sharp taste cut through the growing tobacco scent as Holmes resumed. "You mentioned the safe stood open," Holmes said. "Yet nothing appears missing." "Nothing of value," she answered. "Only a ledger page. Reginald kept it locked away. He said it concerned an old debt from India." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Captain Blaine served in India with your husband, did he not?" She nodded slowly. "They were close ones. Then something happened. Reginald never spoke of it. We excused ourselves and returned to the study. Holmes began a methodical search of the floor. Near the window, a loose board creaked under his weight. He pried it up with his pocket knife. Beneath lay a small metal box, rusted at the edges. Inside were several folded letters, the paper smooth and faintly scented with lavender. The handwriting was feminine, Miss Fenton's. "Love letters," I whispered, feeling the chill deepen despite the fire. "Or something more compromising," Holmes said. "Passion can be motive as surely as money." We questioned Jenkins in the hallway. The old man's leather apron was smooth from years of use. His hands shook as he spoke. "I saw Captain Blaine return to the house after midnight, sir, through the garden gate. He said he'd forgotten his gloves." I thought nothing of it then. Holmes nodded slowly. "You're certain of the time?" Big Ben had just struck one, sir. The chain was lengthening visibly now. Holmes knelt once more by the windowsill and lifted a small quantity of ash that had drifted there, identical in every respect to the pile in the ashtray. "The killer smoked while he waited," he said quietly. "Nerves, perhaps. Or arrogance. The link. This ash on the sill carries the same distinctive Peruvian flake, yet it fell separately from the cigar in the tray. The forge. The two deposits are not contemporaneous. One was left deliberately in the ashtray after the poison had done its work, the other earlier, during the wait. The chain? I recall the case of the speckled band, where the villain lingered outside the victim's room, cigar in mouth, to steady himself before sending the deadly snake through the vandaleta. The ash he left on the sill betrayed his vigil. He had not considered that tobacco ash settles slowly and records time as surely as any clock. Here, too, the ash has timed the crime. The bind. The murderer was in position before the fatal cigar was lit. Holmes saw 3 links where most would see one. How many did you spot, dear reader? We returned to Baker Street as evening drew on. The fog had thickened again, pressing against the windows like a living presence. The gasogene fizzed as I prepared brandy and soda. The sweet liquor warmed my throat against the night's chill. Holmes stood before the fire, violin in hand, plucking a few slow, thoughtful notes that mingled with the crackle of burning coal. "Vill and Blaine share the blend," he said. "Thorne had access to the safe and motive in debt. Fenton's letters suggest hidden passion. Croft knows poisons. But the ash on the sill, the mud, the late return, these point most strongly to one manual." I nodded, the smooth glass cool in my palm. "And the missing ledger page? Likely the record of that Indian debt. Blaine's name will be on it, I wager." The fire popped. The fog horns moaned once more from the river. Holmes' method never ceased to astonish me. You, dear reader, may already feel the chain growing heavier, link by link. The chain grows stronger. Logic binds. Chapter 4. testing the links. As I turned the pages of my journal to the fourth day, I recall how the fog had begun to thin at last, though a persistent damp chill still hung over London like a half-forgotten guest. The morning light filtering through the curtains at 221B Baker Street was pale and watery. The coal fire burned low but steady, filling the room with warmth, and the familiar sharp scent of Holmes' tobacco mingled with the faint bitterness of breakfast coffee. Mrs. Hudson had left the tray. The toast was cold now, but the hot tea still steamed in my cup, its taste cutting cleanly against the lingering fog on my palate. Holmes stood at the window, violin tucked under his chin, drawing a few slow, meditative notes that vibrated through the quiet. "Today we test the chain, Watson," he said, setting the instrument aside. "We shall pull at each link. Some will snap. The true ones will hold." His eyes held that peculiar gleam of anticipation. We set out without delay. Our first destination was the East End wharves near the tobacco docks. The hansom rattled over uneven cobblestones, splashing through shallow puddles that carried the sour, muddy smell of the Thames. Foghorns still moaned, though fainter now, and the air grew thick with tar, rope, and the heavy, Swedish odor of unloaded bales of leaf tobacco. Dock workers and rough serge shouted over the creak of cranes and the slap of water against pilings. Holmes questioned a foreman whose leather apron was stiff with age and salt. "Captain Blaine, was he here recently?" "Aye, sir. Supervised a shipment 3 days back. Left his mark boots thick with our red clay." The man spat into the water. "He was in a temper, too." Holmes nodded. The mud on Blaine's boots matched the traces in the study garden. A link held firm. Another suspicion strengthened. We moved next to Silas Thorne's city office. The streets rang with the clatter of hansoms and the deep toll of Big Ben marking the hour. Inside, the air smelled of ink, sealing wax, and the milder smoke of Thorne's Latakia pipe. He rose nervously from behind his desk as we entered. "Your telegram to Sir Reginald," Holmes began without preamble, producing a copy from his pocket. "It demanded immediate settlement of a debt. Yet you claimed the matter was minor." Thorne's pipe trembled in his hand. Ash fell in a fine gray shower, quite unlike the silvery flake we sought. "Business pressure, nothing more. I left his house early. My club porter will confirm it." Holmes' gaze was steady. "We shall see." But the man's alibi, when checked later by telegram, cracked. The porter remembered Thorne arriving after midnight, flushed and agitated. A weak link bent, then broke. Our third call was Edmund Vale's warehouse on the Commercial Road. The vast space reeked of exotic tobaccos, dark, spicy, overwhelming. Crates stood stacked to the rafters. The wooden floors creaked under our boots. Vale met us near a humidifier, a fresh Havana between his fingers. "Your Peruvian blend," Holmes said, indicating the ashtray, "identical to the fatal cigar's ash." Vale exhaled slowly. "Many men smoke it. I was with my sister after dinner, comforting her. Ask her." Yet when we pressed, a worker volunteered that Vale had been absent from the warehouse for several hours that night. Opportunity existed. The link quivered but did not yet snap. We continued to Miss Eliza Fenton's Bloomsbury flat. The narrow stairs groaned. The small sitting room smelled of damp wool and the faint lavender of her shawl. She received us with trembling hands, offering tea whose heat could not banish the chill in her eyes. "The letters beneath the floorboard," Holmes said gently. "You loved Sir Reginald." Tears welled. "Yes, but I would never harm him. I left before midnight." Dr. Croft saw me depart. Her distress was genuine. Her alibi, when confirmed, held solid. The chain of passion led nowhere toward murder. A link dissolved entirely. At Dr. Harlencroft's Harley Street surgery, the sharp sting of carbolic soap met us like a slap. Instruments gleamed coldly on trays. A small fire crackled in the grate. Croft stood erect, unruffled. "You have cyanide in your dispensary," Holmes stated, "for scientific preparations only, locked and accounted for." He offered us bitter coffee. Its taste matched the antiseptic air. I prescribed nothing to Sir Reginald that night. My nurse will swear I was seeing patients until 11. The nurse's statement proved accurate. Croft's knowledge of poisons had seemed promising. Now it crumbled. Another weak link shattered. Our final test took us to Captain Blaine's club in Pall Mall. The broad room was thick with cigar smoke and the creak of leather armchairs. Billiard balls clicked softly in the distance. Blaine greeted us with forced heartiness, lighting a fresh Havana, the ash falling in the telltale flaky pattern. "Your argument with Sir Reginald," Holmes said, "over money from India, and your late return to the house. Jenkins saw you." Blaine's face darkened. "A private matter. I retrieved forgotten papers, nothing more." Holmes produced the small envelope of dockside clay. "This mud is on your boots. It matches the garden path. You did not enter by the front door." Blaine's hand tightened on the cigar. The link held, strong, unyielding. Back at Baker Street, as twilight gathered, the fog had returned in earnest, pressing damply against the glass. The gasogene hissed. I poured brandy, its sweet warmth spreading through me. Holmes stood before the fire, pipe in hand, the coal crackling like soft applause. "We have tested them all," he said quietly. Fenton's affection, Croft's poisons, Thorne's debts, Vale's rivalry, all red herrings, weak links that snapped under pressure. Only Blaine remains. The ash, the mud, the late return, the missing ledger page, they hold fast. I nodded slowly, the smooth glass cool against my palm. "Then he is our man. The chain is emerging clearly now, Watson. One final pull, and it will bind him utterly." The fire popped. Distant foghorns answered like echoes of the river. Holmes's logic had sifted truth from deception with surgical precision. You, dear reader, may have felt the weaker links give way as I did. Did you see which ones would break before they did? Weak links shattered. The true chain emerges. Chapter 5. The Chain Tightens. The fifth day dawned with a sudden lifting of the fog, though a bitter, penetrating cold still clung to the streets of London. I record these events from my journal with a sense of mounting tension, for it was clear now that the scattered links were drawing inexorably together. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned high, its crackle filling the room with warmth, while the sharp scent of Holmes's tobacco mingled with the faint, lingering bitterness of breakfast tea. Mrs. Hudson had just cleared the table. The porcelain cups still steamed faintly, their heat contrasting the chill that pressed against the window panes. Holmes stood before the fire, hands clasped behind his back, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light of certainty. "The time has come to tighten the chain, Watson," he said. "We summon them all to the Hargrove mansion this afternoon. Confrontation will reveal what questioning alone could not." He dispatched telegrams at once, short, urgent messages to each of the 5 guests, and we prepared to leave. The hansom cab rattled through the thinning mist, wheels hissing over damp cobblestones, the horses' breath clouding in the cold air. Big Ben told the hour as we crossed the city, its deep notes carrying clearly now that the fog no longer muffled them. We arrived at the Kensington mansion first. Jenkins admitted us with his usual quiet deference. The hallway smelled of beeswax and the faint, stale residue of old cigars. Lady Hargrove met us in the drawing room, her silk gown rustling softly, her face pale but composed. "They are coming?" she asked. "All of them," Holmes replied. "The truth will emerge before this evening." One by one they arrived. Edmund Vale entered first, the rich aroma of his Havana preceding him like a herald. Silas Thorne followed, pipe already alight, the milder Latakia smoke curling around him. Dr. Harlan Croft arrived last, precise and unruffled, the sharp, carbolic scent of his surgery still clinging to his coat. Captain Roderick Blaine was the final arrival, broad-shouldered, loud-voiced, a fresh cigar already between his fingers. Holmes gathered them in the study. The fire had been lit. Its warmth battled the cold draft from the window, though the room still felt morgue-like. The gas lamps burned bright, throwing long shadows across the desk where Sir Reginald had died. The ashtray remained, its silvery ash untouched. "Gentlemen and madam," Holmes began, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of inevitability, "we are here to resolve a murder. The chain of evidence is nearly complete. One link remains to be forged in your presence." Tension thickened the air. Blaine shifted in his chair. The leather creaked. Thorne's pipe trembled slightly. Vale exhaled a long plume of smoke. Fenton clasped her hands tightly. Croft watched with clinical detachment. Holmes turned first to Blaine. "Captain, your boots carried dockside clay into this room. Clay that matches the garden path outside the window. You returned after midnight. Jenkins saw you." Blaine's face flushed. "I told you I forgot my gloves. I retrieved them and left. Yet you lingered," Holmes continued. "You smoked while you waited. The ash on the sill is yours, Peruvian flake, identical to that in the tray. You poisoned the cigar before Sir Reginald returned to smoke it alone." Blaine surged to his feet. "Lies. I argued with him, yes, over money from India, but murder, never." He bolted for the door. Holmes moved swiftly to block the hall. I sprang after Blaine as he dashed through the French windows into the garden. The cold air struck like a blow. Rain had begun again, pattering on the leaves. Lane's boots pounded across the wet lawn, splashing mud that smelled of the Thames. I pursued, heart hammering, the rough tweed of my coat tearing on a thorn bush. Holmes was close behind. Blaine reached the garden gate, fumbling with a latch. I tackled him from behind. We fell together onto the damp grass, the cold earth pressing through my clothes. He struggled, breath hot and ragged, the scent of his cigar still on him. Holmes arrived, cuffs ready. The metal clicked shut with a finality that echoed even above the rain. We dragged him back inside. The others had followed to the doorway, faces pale. Blaine was thrust into a chair. Rain dripped from his coat onto the carpet. Holmes produced a small leather case from Blaine's pocket. Inside lay half a dozen cigars, the same rare blend. He held one up. "You prepared these." One was laced with cyanide, enough to kill when burned and inhaled. The wrapper fragment in the ash confirms it. Blaine's shoulders sagged. "He ruined me," he muttered. "Exposed my smuggling in India. Cost me my commission, my honor. I waited years. When his debts mounted, I saw my chance. I came back. I waited. I poisoned the cigar while he argued with Thorne downstairs. I thought it would look like suicide." A telegram arrived then, urgent from Scotland Yard. Jenkins had been re-interviewed. He confirmed seeing Blaine slip into the study with a small vial. The final link snapped into place. Before Holmes explained further, "What does this chain of ash, mud, late return, and old grudge tell you, dear listener?" Holmes turned to the others. "Vale, your rivalry was real but innocent. Thorne, your debt's genuine but not murderous. Miss Fenton, your affection's sincere but harmless. Dr. Croft, your poison's accounted for." Only one man's links held fast. Reflection came later at Baker Street, the fire roaring against the night's chill. The gasogene fizzed. Sweet brandy warmed my throat. Holmes paced slowly, violin strings twanging absently. "It recalls the Musgrave ritual," he said quietly. "There, too, a hidden past chained a man to murder, old oaths buried treasure, and a single overlooked detail that betrayed him. Lane forgot that ash settles slowly, that mud clings, that servants remember. His arrogance forged the very chain that bound him." The rain drummed on the roof. Fog horns answered from the river. Holmes' method had turned scattered clues into an unbreakable cord. I marveled, as always, at the precision of it. The chain tightens. No escape now. Chapter 6. Links to the past. The sixth day of our investigation brought a strange calm after the storm of the previous afternoon's confrontation. The fog had returned in earnest during the night, blanketing London once more in its damp, muffling shroud. Yet inside 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned with steady vigor, throwing a warm orange glow across the familiar clutter of chemical apparatus, scattered papers, and the ever-present Persian slipper where Holmes kept his tobacco. I record these events from my journal with a sense of quiet finality, for the chain was no longer merely forming. It had begun to reveal its full length, stretching back through years into shadowed history. Breakfast was simple. Hot tea whose bitter edge cut through the lingering sweetness of marmalade, toast crisp at the corners, the porcelain warm in my hands against the chill that still seeped under the door. Holmes ate little, standing before the mantel with his long fingers steepled, eyes distant as though he were already traveling backward in time. "The present crime is explained, Watson," he said quietly, "but the motive lies buried in the past. We must dig there now before the yard takes Blaine away and the records are sealed." We set out in a hansom cab, the wheels rumbling over wet cobblestones, the horses' hoofs clipping steadily through the mist. The air outside carried the familiar mixture of coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint, sour tang of the Thames drifting inland on the breeze. Our first destination was the India office in Whitehall, a grim stone building whose corridors smelled of old leather bindings, sealing wax, and the faint mustiness of forgotten files. A clerk led us to a dim archive room lit by a single gas lamp. Shelves towered above us, heavy with volumes bound in cracked calfskin. Holmes produced his credentials. The clerk reluctantly brought forward a thick dossier marked Indian Army, Captain R. Blaine, 1878 to 1885. The pages crackled as we turned them. The ink faded, but still legible. The record told a grim story. Blaine had been a promising officer until 1883, when he was implicated in a smuggling ring involving tobacco and opium shipments from Calcutta to Bombay. The man who exposed the operation quietly, without public scandal, was then Major Reginald Hargrove, serving in the same regiment. "See here," Holmes murmured, tracing a line with his finger. "Hargrove's report is brief but damning. Blaine was court-martialed in secret, stripped of his commission, and sent home in disgrace. No prison term. Hargrove intervened to avoid a full trial, perhaps out of old friendship. But the stain remained. Blaine never forgave. The texture of the old paper was rough under my fingertips. The faint scent of mildew clung to it. Outside, Big Ben told noon, its deep notes muffled by the fog. Holmes closed the dossier with a decisive snap. "Revenge, then," I said, "delayed for nearly a decade." "Precisely, and made possible when Hargrove's own fortunes faltered. Blaine waited until the man was vulnerable. Debts mounting, business failing, then struck. Our next stop was Blaine's lodgings in a quiet street off the Strand. The landlady admitted us reluctantly after Holmes showed his card. The rooms were small and sparsely furnished, the air thick with stale cigar smoke and the damp smell of unaired woolens. A small fire smoldered in the grate. The hearthrug bore faint traces of dockside clay. Holmes moved at once to the writing desk. In the bottom drawer, beneath a pile of unpaid bills, lay a thin packet of letters tied with twine. The paper was cheap, the handwriting bold and angry. They were drafts, never sent, of threats addressed to Hargrove. "You ruined me in India," one began. "Now I ruin you in London. Your debts are nothing compared to the honor you stole." Another, dated only weeks before the murder. "The cigar will be your last luxury. Smoke it slowly. Remember Calcutta." I felt a chill deeper than the room's cold air. He planned it meticulously. "Indeed," Holmes said, folding the letters carefully into his pocket. "The ash, the mud, the vial, all pieces of a design years in the making. The past and present are one unbroken chain." We returned to Baker Street as the afternoon light began to fail. The fog pressed thickly against the windows, carrying the low moan of foghorns from the river. The gasogene fizzed as I prepared brandy and soda. The sweet liquor warmed my throat, cutting through the day's accumulated chill. Holmes stood before the fire, pipe in hand, drawing slow, thoughtful puffs that sent blue curls rising toward the ceiling. "The motive is clear now," he said. "Blaine did not kill in sudden passion. He waited, patiently, coldly, until the moment was perfect. Hargrove's kindness in sparing him a public trial became Blaine's greatest grievance. He saw mercy as insult, protection as humiliation. When Hargrove's empire began to crumble, Blaine saw his chance to repay in kind. I sat in the armchair, feeling the worn leather cool against my back. And the others? All red herrings. Every one. Vale's rivalry, Thorne's debts, Fenton's affection, Croft's knowledge of poisons, they clouded the view, but they did not form the chain. Only Blaine's history did. The ash linked to his blend, the mud to his presence, the letters to his grudge. Link by link, the past pulled him into the present. The fire crackled, The violin lay silent on the table. Holmes reached for the Persian slipper, replenishing his pipe with deliberate care. "It is always the overlooked history that binds the strongest," he mused. "Men believe the past is buried. They forget that old wounds fester. Old debts are never canceled. Old betrayals wait only for the right hour." I nodded slowly, the brandy's warmth spreading through me. Holmes' mind had reached backward across years and continents to find the thread that tied everything together. You, dear reader, may now see how the chain stretched far beyond that smoky study in Kensington. Did you sense its length before the final links were revealed? The gas lamps hissed softly. Outside, the foghorns answered one another like distant voices. Holmes resumed his pacing, the floorboards creaking faintly under his steps. The day had shown us not merely a murder, but the long shadow cast by an old wrong, past and present, one unbroken chain. Chapter 7. The complete chain. The seventh day arrived with a crispness that seemed almost cleansing after weeks of fog and rain. By morning, the sky had cleared enough for pale sunlight to filter through the curtains at 221B Baker Street, though a lingering chill still clung to the air. The coal fire burned steadily, its crackle a comforting constant amid the faint scent of Holmes' tobacco and the bitter edge of fresh coffee Mrs. Hudson had left on the side table. I write these lines from my journal with a sense of conclusion settling over me, for today the chain would be presented in full, link by link, before those who most needed to witness its strength. Holmes stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the street below, where hansoms moved briskly now that the mist had lifted. "We go to Scotland Yard," he said without turning. "Lestrade has arranged the gathering. Blaine is in custody, but the others must hear the explanation. Only then will the chain be complete." We descended the 17 steps, donned our overcoats, the rough tweed still carrying a trace of yesterday's damp, and took a cab to the yard. The journey was swift. The wheels clattered over dry cobblestones for the first time in days, the horses' hooves ringing clearly. Big Ben told the hour as we arrived, its deep notes echoing across the embankment. Inspector Lestrade met us in a large interview room whose walls smelled faintly of carbolic soap and old pipe smoke. A long oak table stood in the center, surrounded by plain wooden chairs. The gas lamps burned bright despite the daylight, casting steady light on the faces already assembled. Lady Hargrove, pale but composed in black silk. Edmund Vale, cigar unlit between tense fingers. Silas Thorne, pipe clenched tight. Missy Eliza Fenton, eyes downcast, hands folded in her lap. Dr. Harlan Croft, erect and watchful. Captain Roderick Blaine sat at the far end, wrists manacled, his broad shoulders slumped, the fire gone from his eyes. Lestrade nodded to Holmes. "They're all here as requested. The floor is yours." Holmes took his place at the head of the table, standing rather than sitting, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished wood. He spoke quietly at first, but with such precision that every word carried. "The chain begins with the ash in the ashtray, flaky, silvery, distinctive." He placed the small vial on the table. The gray flakes caught the light. "This is no ordinary tobacco. It is a rare Havana blend with Peruvian herb. Burned slowly, leaves this characteristic residue. Only 2 men in our circle smoked it regularly, Mr. Vale and Captain Blaine. Mr. Vale's alibi held, Captain Blaine's did not. He moved to the next link, the dockside clay on the study rug and on the garden path outside the window. Reddish, gritty, mixed with urban soot, found only near the East End wharves where tobacco ships unload. Captain Blaine supervised a shipment there days before the murder. His boots carried it into the house when he returned after midnight. Jenkins saw him enter by the garden gate. Blaine shifted. The manacles clinked softly. "Timeline," Holmes continued. "Dinner ended at 10. Most guests departed by 11. Captain Blaine argued with Sir Reginald over an old debt, left in anger, but returned after 1 o'clock. He waited in the study, smoking while he prepared the fatal cigar. The ash on the windowsill fell separately, earlier than the pile in the tray. He laced the cigar with cyanide from a vial later found in his possession. Sir Reginald returned alone, lit the poisoned cigar, and died. Blaine slipped away, leaving the door locked from inside, a simple trick with a string and a keyhole. Thorne leaned forward. But the safe, papers disturbed. Disturbed by Blaine, Holmes answered. He sought the ledger page recording his disgrace in India. He found it, removed it, but in haste left the safe open. That single missing page was the final physical clue. He turned to the witnesses. Jenkins saw Blaine's late return and confirmed it under renewed questioning. The night porter at Blaine's club remembered him leaving again shortly after midnight, agitated, carrying a small parcel. No other suspect fits the hour. Motive, Holmes said, his voice lowering. In 1883, Captain Blaine was caught smuggling tobacco and opium in India. The officer who exposed him quietly, sparing him a public trial, was Major Reginald Hargrove. Blaine lost his commission but kept his liberty through Hargrove's mercy. He never forgave that mercy. Years later, when Hargrove's business faltered, Blaine saw his opportunity. The cigar, Hargrove's own luxury, became the instrument of revenge. Blaine lifted his head at last. His voice was hoarse. He ruined me, took everything. I waited until he tasted failure himself. The cigar was slow. I wanted him to know it was coming. A hush fell. Lady Hargrove covered her mouth. Fenton's eyes filled with tears. Holmes placed the final link on the table, the packet of threatening letters found in Blaine's desk. These drafts were never posted, but they confess intent. The cigar will be your last luxury. The handwriting matches. The chain is forged, ash to blend, mud to presence, timeline to opportunity, witness to confirmation, motive to history, letters to confession. He looked slowly around the table. Every link accounted for, the chain complete. Blaine's head sank to his chest. Lestrade rose and motioned to the constables. Blaine was led away, the clink of manacles echoing down the corridor. The others sat in stunned silence. Lady Hargrove spoke first, voice trembling. Then it is over. It is over, Holmes said gently. Your husband was murdered, madam, but not by chance or despair. By a man who nursed a grudge for 9 years. Justice now takes its course. Vale exhaled shackily. I thought perhaps my rivalry. No, Holmes replied. Your competition was honest. Thorne's debts real, but unrelated. Miss Fenton's affection sincere, but innocent. Dr. Croft's knowledge irrelevant. Only one chain held. We left the yard as the afternoon sun broke fully through the clouds. The air felt lighter, cleaner. Back at Baker Street, the fire still burned. The gasogene fizzed as I poured brandy. The sweet warmth spread through me, easing the tension of the day. Holmes stood before the hearth, pipe in hand. The chain is forged in reason, Watson. Each link tested, each connection proved. When observation meets logic, no deception can withstand it. I nodded, the smooth glass cool in my palm. You saw it from the first ash. I saw the possibility. The links themselves revealed the truth. Outside, London moved on, hansoms clattering, vendors calling, Big Ben tolling the hour. The game had ended. Justice had bound its quarry. Every link accounted for. The chain complete. Chapter 8. Justice in chains. The 8th day brought a quiet finality to the affair, the kind that settles over London after a long storm has passed. The fog had retreated entirely by morning, leaving the sky a pale, clear blue, and the air sharp with the first true bite of approaching winter. I set these events down in my journal as the last echoes of the case faded, for justice, once set in motion, moves with its own inexorable rhythm. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned low and steady, its warmth a gentle counterpoint to the chill outside. The scent of Holmes' tobacco lingered in the curtains. The gasogene stood silent on the sideboard, the Tantalus still holding the brandy we had not yet touched. A telegram arrived shortly after breakfast, short official from Lestrade, arrest formalized. Blaine at yard. Request your presence for formalities. Others summoned. Holmes read it without comment, folded the paper neatly, and reached for his coat. We shall witness the binding of the last link, he said simply. Come, Watson. The hansom carried us through streets that seemed brighter, cleaner. the clatter of wheels on dry cobblestones ringing with unusual clarity. Big Ben struck 10 as we approached Scotland Yard. Its toll echoed across the embankment, solemn and unhurried. Inside the building, the air smelled of polished wood, ink, and the faint carbolic residue of thorough cleaning. Lestrade met us in a narrow corridor, his face less strained than it had been in days. "He's ready," Lestrade said. "Confession signed last night. No fight left in him." We were led to a small, bare room with whitewashed walls and a single high window. Captain Roderick Blaine sat at a scarred oak table, wrists still manacled, though the chains were longer now, allowing him to rest his hands on the wood. His broad shoulders sagged. The once boisterous voice was reduced to a low rasp. 2 constables stood at the door, silent. Blaine looked up as we entered. His eyes met Holmes without defiance, only a weary recognition. "You came to see the end of it," he said. "I came to see justice served," Holmes replied quietly. "The chain is forged. Now it binds." Lestrade spread the confession before him, a neat sheaf of foolscap covered in Blaine's heavy hand. The words were stark: admission of the poisoning, the late return to the house, the wait in the study, the cyanide in the cigar. No excuses, no pleas, only the cold facts of a 9-year grudge made manifest. Blaine signed again at the bottom, the pen scratching loudly in the silence. When he finished, he pushed the papers away. "I thought it would feel like victory," he muttered. "It doesn't. Just empty." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You mistook revenge for justice. The chain you forged was never yours to wield." Blaine's shoulders shook once, a single silent sob. Then he straightened. "Take me away." The constables stepped forward. The chains clinked as they rose, a soft metallic sound that echoed in the small room like the final toll of a bell. Blaine walked between them, head high but steps heavy, down the corridor toward the cells. The door closed behind him with a dull thud. Outside in the main hall, the other figures from the case waited. Lady Hargrove stood near the window, black veil lifted, her face composed though pale. Edmund Vale leaned against a pillar, unlit cigar between his fingers. Silas Thorne fidgeted with his pipe, unlit as well. Miss Fenton sat on a bench, hands clasped tightly. Dr. Croft stood apart, arms folded, expression clinical. Lestrade addressed them collectively. "The confession is complete. Captain Blaine will face trial for murder. The Crown's case is ironclad, thanks in no small part to Mr. Holmes." Lady Hargrove turned to Holmes. "I cannot thank you enough, Reginald. He deserved better than to die by an old comrade's hand." Holmes inclined his head. "The truth is its own repayment, madam." Vale spoke next, voice rough. "I thought perhaps my rivalry had poisoned things between us. I see now it was nothing compared to what festered in Blaine." Thorne exhaled shackily. "My debts were real, but they were my own burden, not his motive." Fenton whispered, "I loved him, but I could never have harmed him. Thank you for proving that." Croft merely nodded. "The science of poisons is precise. So too is your science of deduction." Holmes looked at each in turn. "The loose ends are tied. Vale, your business rivalry ends honorably now, perhaps even prospers without Hargrove's shadow. Thorne, settle your accounts. The ledger page Blaine took will be returned from evidence. Miss Fenton, your heart was true. Time will heal what grief remains. Dr. Croft, your knowledge was never in question." Lestrade cleared his throat. "The Yard owes you a debt, Holmes." Again, Holmes waved it aside. "The debt is to observation and reason, nothing more." We left the building together, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. The Thames glittered under the winter sun. Gulls wheeled above the water, their cries sharp and clean. A hansom waited at the curb. As we climbed in, Holmes paused. "The criminal is bound," he said quietly. "Justice served not by vengeance, but by the chain itself." Back at Baker Street, the fire had been tended. Warmth welcomed us like an old friend. I poured brandy sweet, burning down the throat, and we sat in silence for a time. The gas lamps hissed softly. Outside, London continued its endless rhythm, hansoms passing, vendors calling, the distant toll of Big Ben marking the hours. Holmes drew on his pipe, sending slow curls of smoke toward the ceiling. A case concluded, Watson. Yet each one teaches the same lesson. Deception may wear many faces, but truth is forged in links too strong to break. I nodded, the smooth glass cool in my hand. And when the chain is complete, there is no escape. None, he agreed. The day ended quietly. The fire crackled. The fog would doubtless return tomorrow, but for now the air was clear. Blaine's shadow had been lifted from Kensington. The innocent walked free. Justice had closed its clasp. The criminal bound. Justice served. Chapter 9. Links restored. The ninth day dawned with a rare winter clarity over London. The sky a pale, unblemished blue that seemed to wash away the last traces of fog and shadow from the preceding weeks. I set these final reflections down in my journal with a sense of quiet restoration. For though the crime had been solved and the criminal bound, true justice extends beyond the courtroom. It reaches into the lives left disrupted, the reputations tarnished, the futures left uncertain. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned low and steady, its gentle crackle mingling with the soft hiss of the gas lamps. The air carried the familiar warmth of Holmes' tobacco, now tempered by the faint, clean scent of frost that drifted in whenever the window was open. Mrs. Hudson brought up a late breakfast, hot tea steaming in the pot, its bitter edge softened by a touch of milk, toast golden at the edges, and a small pot of marmalade whose sharp citrus cut pleasantly through the lingering chill. Holmes sat in his armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, a copy of the Times open across his knees. He read in silence for a time, then folded the paper neatly. The wheels of the law turn at last, he said. Blaine's trial concluded this morning, swift, as such cases often are when confession is complete. Guilty on all counts. Sentence: penal servitude for life. I set my cup down, the porcelain warm against my palm. And the others? They are free to rebuild. The innocent links, once tested and found true, returned to their proper places. The first formalities had taken place in the Old Bailey 2 days earlier. The courtroom smelled of polished oak, old paper, and the faint carbolic soap used to scrub the floors each night. Blaine stood in the dock, manacles removed but shoulders bowed, as the judge pronounced sentence in measured tones. No outburst, no plea for mercy, only a single weary nod. The gallery had been sparse. Lady Hargrove sat alone in the front row, black veil lowered, face impassive. When the gavel fell, she rose without a word and left, the rustle of her silk gown the only sound in the sudden hush. Afterward, in the corridor outside, the others gathered briefly. Edmund Vale approached Holmes first, extending a hand. I thought my rivalry might have cast a longer shadow, he said quietly. Thank you for clearing it. Holmes clasped the hand briefly. Your competition was always fair, Mr. Vale. Your business will thrive now, without the poison of suspicion. Silas Thorne came next, pipe unlit in his fingers, his usual nervousness replaced by something like relief. The ledger page was returned from evidence this morning. My debts. They remain, but at least they are mine alone now. No murder attached to them. Settle them honorably, Holmes advised. And remember that partners may quarrel, but they need not destroy. Miss Eliza Fenton stood a little apart, eyes still shadowed with grief. She spoke softly, almost to herself. I loved him, and I feared the world would think that love had turned to something darker. You proved it had not. Your affection was genuine, Holmes replied. Time will dull the pain, and memory will keep what was good. Dr. Harlan Croft approached last, his manner as precise as ever. My dispensary records were examined, every grain of cyanide accounted for. No stain remains. Nor should there have been, Holmes said. Science serves truth, not deception. Lady Hargrove had waited until the others departed. She approached Holmes slowly, lifting her veil. Her face, though lined with sorrow, held a quiet strength. Reginald is gone, she said, but his name is cleared. The house in Kensington will be sold. Too many memories, but I shall continue his work in the trade with Vale's help. Perhaps some good can come from this. Holmes inclined his head. He would have wished that. We returned to Baker Street in the afternoon. The sun slanted low through the windows, gilding the dust motes that danced above the carpet. Holmes took up his violin, drawing slow, thoughtful notes that filled the room like a gentle tide. I sat by the fire, brandy in hand, the sweet warmth spreading through me as the day's events settled into perspective. London, too, seemed to reclaim its rhythm. Hansoms clattered along Baker Street with renewed purpose. Vendors called their wares in clearer voices. The distant toll of Big Ben marked the hours without the muffling weight of fog. In Kensington, the Hargrove mansion stood quiet, its shutters closed, but already whispers of new ownership circulated. In the city, Thorne's office lights burned late as he pored over ledgers with fresh resolve. Vale's warehouse bustled once more, the rich scent of tobacco no longer shadowed by suspicion. Miss Fenton resumed her quiet life in Bloomsbury, her grief private but unburdened by accusation. Dr. Croft's surgery in Harley Street continued its steady work, the sharp smell of carbolic a reminder of order restored. Holmes set the violin aside and reached for his pipe. "The chain was never meant to hang forever," he said. "Once it has bound the guilty, it releases the innocent. That is its true purpose." I nodded, watching the firelight play across the worn leather of the armchair. "And London moves on, as it always does. The streets are cleared. The air is lighter. The fog will return in its season, but not the shadow of this crime." Outside, the winter sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the rooftops. The gas lamps were lit one by one along Baker Street, their soft glow pushing back the early dusk. Inside, the fire crackled. The brandy's sweetness lingered on my tongue. Holmes drew slowly on his pipe, sending blue curls toward the ceiling. The case had ended not with drama, but with quiet restoration. Reputations mended, futures reclaimed, order reasserted in the intricate web of London life. Blaine remained in chains. The rest walked free. Order restored to London streets. Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street. The 10th and final day of recording this strange affair found us once more in the familiar embrace of 221B Baker Street. The winter evening had drawn in early. The sky beyond the windows already a deep indigo pierced by the soft yellow glow of gas lamps along the street. Inside, the coal fire burned with a steady, contented crackle, throwing warm light across the worn carpet. The scattered chemical apparatus, the violin resting on its table, and the two armchairs where Holmes and I sat at ease after many weeks of tension. The air carried the rich, earthy aroma of Holmes' shag tobacco, the faint sweetness of brandy from the glasses on the side table, and the clean, frosty scent that slipped in whenever Mrs. Hudson opened the door to bring fresh coals. I had finished my journal entry for the day. The last pages now lay closed on the desk, the ink still faintly gleaming. Holmes lounged in his chair, legs stretched toward the hearth, pipe in hand, drawing slow, meditative puffs that sent blue curls drifting upward. The gasogene stood silent. No urgent telegrams had arrived. No footsteps hurried up the 17 stairs. For once, the rooms felt truly at rest. "The newspapers have it all now," Holmes remarked, nodding toward the folded copies of the Times and the Pall Mall Gazette on the table between us. "Blaine's trial, conviction, sentence, penal servitude for life. The headlines call it the cigar of vengeance, a trifle sensational, but accurate enough." I sipped my brandy. The sweet burn lingered pleasantly on my tongue. "They mention you only in passing." The well-known consulting detective whose observations led to the arrest. Holmes smiled faintly. "As it should be. The credit belongs to the chain itself, each link forged by simple observation, tested by logic, and bound by reason. When the chain is complete, the name of its maker matters little." We sat in companionable silence for a time, the fire popping softly, the distant clatter of a late hansom fading down Baker Street. I thought back over the case, the first silvery ash in the ashtray, the dockside clay on the rug, the late return witnessed by Jenkins, the threatening letters hidden in a drawer, the old grudge buried in Indian records. Each piece had seemed small, almost trivial, yet together they formed an unbreakable cord that had drawn a murderer from the shadows into the light. Holmes seemed to follow my thoughts. "You've seen my method at work many times, Watson," he said quietly, "but perhaps never so clearly as in this affair. The chain is not a metaphor. It is the very essence of deduction. Start with the particular. A flake of ash unlike any other. Observe its properties, texture, color, burn pattern. Connect it to a rare blend smoked by only a handful of men in London. Test the connection against alibis, motives, opportunities. Discard the weak links, Vale's rivalry, Thorne's debts, Fenton's affection, Croft's knowledge of poisons, until only one remains unyielding, Blaine's history of betrayal and revenge. He paused, drawing again on his pipe. I recall the very first case we shared, the study in scarlet. There, too, a single observation, the word rake scrawled in blood, seemed meaningless until linked to a broader chain. A wedding ring, a poison pill, tracks in the dust of a Brixton house, an old American feud carried across an ocean. The murderer had believed distance and time would protect him. He forgot that small details endure, that revenge leaves traces as surely as footsteps in wet clay. Blaine made the same mistake. He thought 9 years and a locked door would erase the past. He did not reckon on how faithfully the physical world records every act, ash settling on a sill, mud clinging to a boot, a letter never posted but never destroyed. I nodded slowly. And yet, each time I think I have grasped your method, a new case shows me how much deeper it goes. Holmes' eyes gleamed in the firelight. It is no mystery, Watson, only relentless observation. Most men see, few truly observe. They notice the cigar, but not its ash. They see the safe open, but not the single missing page. They hear of an argument, but not the grudge that fed it for a decade. When you train yourself to notice the trifles, the texture of ash, the color of mud, the wear on a safe's dial, the trifles cease to be trifles. They become the links that bind the guilty and free the innocent. He leaned forward slightly, gesturing with the stem of his pipe. Consider the science of it. Every act leaves evidence, physical, chemical, temporal. Cyanide in a cigar alters the burn. Dockside clay adheres differently from garden soil. A man's absence at his club at a precise hour contradicts his stated movements. Eliminate the impossible, alibis that collapse, motives that dissolve under scrutiny. And what remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The chain forms itself. We merely trace it. The fire settled with a soft sigh, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, Big Ben tolled 9, its deep notes carrying clearly through the cold night air. Holmes set his pipe aside and reached for the violin, tucking it under his chin. He drew a few slow, haunting notes, nothing elaborate, merely a quiet melody that seemed to echo the winding path of the case from first link to last. When he finished, he laid the instrument down again. The game continues, Watson, he said softly. There will be another knock on the door, another puzzle brought up the stairs, another chain to forge. But for tonight, let us sit by the fire and be content that this one is complete. I raised my glass in silent agreement. The brandy's warmth spread through me. The fire's glow wrapped us in comfort. London lay beyond the windows, streets quiet now, gas lamps flickering, the Thames flowing unseen in the dark. Somewhere in that vast city another crime was perhaps already being planned, another deception woven. But here, in these familiar rooms, order had been restored, truth had prevailed, and the chain of reason had done its work. Until the next chain forges, dear listener, the game continues.